The afternoon heat pressed down on the Marrakesh marketplace like an invisible hand, turning the narrow alleyways into rivers of sweat and spiced air. Jasmine wove through the crowded souk with practiced urgency, her vintage camera clutched to her chest like a lifeline. The monsoon rains had arrived unexpectedly, transforming the terracotta-colored pathways into impromptu waterslides, and vendors scrambled to cover their overflowing stalls with tarps and cardboard. She was fleeing, not from danger, but from the persistent merchant who'd mistaken her genuine interest in his late father's ancient maps for a purchasing obligation. The old man had pressed rolled parchments into her hands, speaking rapidly in French and Arabic, insisting that her eyes held the same curiosity as someone he'd once known. Jasmine had politely declined, but the interaction had left her unsettled, touching something deeper she wasn't ready to examine. Darting around a corner, her foot caught on a wet stone, and suddenly she was airborne. The world tilted sideways. She braced for impact with the ground, but instead collided with something solid and warm. Her camera flew upward as strong hands wrapped around her waist, stabilizing her against a stranger's chest. "Careful." A deep voice murmured above her head, tinged with an accent she couldn't quite place. Jasmine pulled back, her heart hammering, and looked up into the face of a man who seemed incongruous with the marketplace chaos surrounding them. His dark eyes held genuine concern, and his tailored linen shirt was now damp from her rain-soaked jacket. He was tall, with the kind of effortless elegance that suggested money and confidence in equal measure. "I'm so sorry," she breathed, reaching for her camera as he gently retrieved it from where it had landed on a nearby spice vendor's display. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his gaze lingering on her face with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. "Just embarrassed," she admitted, managing a self-deprecating smile. "And apparently a danger to everyone around me." Dominic smiled then, a slow, genuine expression that transformed his face from merely attractive to disarming. "I'm Dominic, and for what it's worth, the best moments of my life have started with unexpected collisions." They stood there in the middle of the souk as rain fell around them, and Jasmine felt the first stirring of something she'd been running from, just as hard as she'd been running from that merchant. Something that whispered of complications and possibilities, intertwined, like threads, waiting to be woven into a pattern neither of them could yet see. 3 days later, Jasmine found herself in Dominic's penthouse overlooking the Atlas Mountains, surrounded by leather-bound books and artifacts that suggested a collector's passion for history and discovery. He'd contacted her through the hostel where she was staying, claiming he'd recovered her phone number from a loose notebook in her camera bag that had fallen during their marketplace encounter. Most women would have called it forward. Jasmine called it serendipitous. The penthouse smelled like sandalwood and aged paper. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed layers of mountains dissolving into mist, and Dominic moved through the space with the ease of someone completely comfortable in luxury. He poured mint tea with practiced grace while Jasmine sat on his plush sofa, suddenly conscious of her worn jeans and travel-stained shirt. "You said you had something to show me," she began, uncertain whether this was genuine interest or an elaborate seduction setup. Dominic retrieved a small leather journal from a glass display case. "You mentioned your father was an archaeologist," he said, placing it gently in her hands. And you were searching the souk for information about ancient civilizations. I couldn't help wondering if there was a connection. Her breath caught. She opened the journal, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Her father's meticulous notes filled every page, detailing research about a temple complex that supposedly predated known civilizations in Central America. Her hands trembled slightly. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Dominic sat beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "My grandfather collected antiquities decades ago. This arrived at my family estate months ago from an estate sale, but the significance didn't register until I met you. The handwriting matches the attribution inside. Your father's name is all over these notes." Jasmine's throat tightened with emotion. Her father had disappeared 5 years ago, officially declared lost during an expedition, unofficially considered dead by everyone except Jasmine. She'd spent her entire adulthood trying to piece together his work, to understand what he'd been searching for when he vanished. "There's something else," Dominic continued softly, pulling out an aged map. This was tucked inside. Coordinates, mysterious markers, and what appears to be a riddle written in your father's hand. As Jasmine traced the lines of the map, a shadow fell across the penthouse. She didn't notice until Dominic straightened, his expression shifting from intimate concern to cautious neutrality. Through the glass doors stepped a man who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the merchant from the souk, though older and more weathered. "Faisal," Jasmine breathed, recognition and dread mingling in her voice. Her uncle stepped inside without invitation, his eyes darting between the map and Jasmine's face with calculated intensity. "I was wondering when you'd resurface," he said, his smile thin and predatory, "and when you'd stumble onto what your father should have left well enough alone. That map, Jasmine, belongs to my research. Your father was working for me before his little accident." Hung in the air like a threat, the expedition departed from Belize City on a humid morning that felt like stepping into a living organism. 6 weeks had passed since Faisal's revelation. 6 weeks of research and preparation and difficult conversations with Dominic about whether she could trust him, whether this adventure was genuine or manipulation wearing an attractive mask. He'd earned her trust slowly, proving himself through actions rather than words. When she'd asked him to finance the expedition, he'd agreed without hesitation or conditions, asking nothing in return except to document whatever they found. But trust, she was learning, was a fragile thing. The jungle enveloped them like a breathing entity, all emerald canopy and shadowed depths. Their small team consisted of Marcus, a local guide with eyes that missed nothing, Elena, Dominic's ex-girlfriend, and a former expedition guide who'd recently rejoined his ventures, and 2 porters hired locally. Jasmine tried not to notice how Elena positioned herself beside Dominic during their daily treks, her hand occasionally brushing his shoulder with an intimacy that suggested their relationship had been more than professionally cordial. On the 4th night, as their camp flickered with firelight and the jungle sang its ancient songs, Jasmine excused herself from the group and walked to the edge of their perimeter. She needed space, needed to process the growing intensity of what she felt for Dominic while navigating the shadowy uncertainty of why he was truly here. She found him waiting by a moss-covered outcropping of stone, as though he'd known she would come. "You've been distant," he said, not bothering with preamble, "and I understand. You don't know if I'm here because I care about you, or because I'm invested in the mystery your father left behind." Jasmine sat beside him, not quite touching. "Which is it?" Dominic was quiet for a long moment, listening to the jungle's nocturnal chorus. "It started as curiosity," he admitted, "intellectual fascination with a historical puzzle. But then I met you, and it became about something else entirely. Though I can't expect you to believe that when my own ex-girlfriend is camping 50 meters away, reminding me of all my past mistakes." "Elena?" Jasmine glanced back toward the camp. "We were involved 3 years ago," Dominic explained. "She ended it when she realized my passion for exploration came before emotional availability. I've worked on that flaw since then. I think I'm still working on it. But then you crashed into me in a marketplace, covered in spice dust and righteous indignation. And suddenly I understood what people meant about wanting to become better for someone else." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. The gesture was tender and patient, asking rather than demanding. Jasmine felt herself leaning into his touch, surrendering to the connection that had been building since that first impossible collision. "I want to believe you," she whispered. "Then don't believe my words," Dominic said. "Believe my actions. When we find this temple, when we uncover whatever secrets your father was chasing, I'll prove to you that what I feel is real and separate from the adventure. I promise you that." He kissed her then, slowly and deliberately, a kiss that tasted like jungle humidity and possibility. When he pulled away, the world felt subtly different, as though something fundamental had shifted in the space between them. But as they walked back toward camp, hand in hand, Jasmine noticed Elena watching them from the shadows near the fire, her expression unreadable and calculating. The temple emerged from the jungle like a memory surfacing from deep water. They'd been hacking through dense vegetation for 2 days when Marcus spotted it, half swallowed by centuries of overgrowth and vines that had become one with stone. Jasmine's hands shook as she photographed the weathered carvings, each image a potential piece of her father's unfinished puzzle. The main chamber contained an altar surrounded by astronomical symbols that matched her father's notes precisely. But what stopped everyone cold was the skeleton behind the altar. Remnants of clothing still clinging to ancient bones. "No," Jasmine whispered, unable to move. Dominic wrapped a protective arm around her waist, sensing immediately what she feared. But before he could respond, Faisal emerged from the shadows at the chamber's far end, a gun held casually at his side. "Your father found this place," he said, his voice echoing off stone walls that hadn't heard human speech in centuries. "And he found something he shouldn't have. A pre-Columbian astronomical archive that contradicts everything mainstream archaeology accepts. It would have made him famous, but more importantly, it would have made him dangerous to people with investments in controlling historical narratives." "You killed him," Jasmine breathed, understanding crashing through her like a physical force. "An accident during our expedition," Faisal said with performative regret. "A cave collapse. Tragic, but he was so determined to expose the truth. I had to protect both our interests. The research was too valuable to share, too dangerous to publicize." Elena stepped forward, and Jasmine understood then why she'd seemed so distant, so calculating. "I work for Faisal," Elena explained coldly. "Dominic's involvement was insurance, though his genuine feelings for you complicated matters. Nothing personal." Dominic moved, his hand releasing Jasmine as he turned toward Faisal with barely contained fury. "You used me to find this place. You knew about my family's historical connections to this region. My grandfather's journals had partial information about this temple's location. Precisely, Faisal confirmed. Your obsession with the adventure made you the perfect tool, and your growing feelings for my niece ensured her cooperation. The gun came up fully, its intention suddenly lethal, rather than threatening. But Nora emerged from a passage Jasmine hadn't noticed. An elderly woman with eyes that seemed ancient as the temple itself. The temple does not welcome violence, Nora said simply. And something in her presence made Faisal hesitate. These stones remember your predecessor, Jasmine. Your father sought only knowledge and understanding. He wept when he learned the temple's true purpose. The distraction was enough. Marcus moved with surprising speed, disarming Faisal while Dominic protected Jasmine. Within minutes, Faisal and Alina were secured, and police who Nora had summoned from a hidden communication device were ascending the jungle path. In the silence that followed, Nora revealed the temple's true secret. The astronomical archive contained evidence that Jasmine's father had discovered an ancient civilization that had flourished and disappeared in cycles spanning millennia. The knowledge was valuable, not for fame or profit, but for understanding humanity's capacity for both brilliance and cyclical destruction. Your father spent his final weeks here, learning, Nora explained, her weathered hand gesturing to the altar. When the cave collapsed during Faisal's attempt to remove artifacts, your father sheltered me. He died, ensuring I lived, so the temple's knowledge could be passed to someone worthy. He lived long enough to know he'd left the map for his daughter. He died knowing someone would eventually understand. Jasmine wept against Dominic's chest, holding the ashes of her father's final sacrifice and the revelation of his true legacy. He hadn't been lost. He'd been exactly where he meant to be, exactly where his love had always resided, in the pursuit of truth and the protection of knowledge worth dying for. 6 months later, Jasmine stood on the terrace of a research institute overlooking the Caribbean coast, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of amber and rose. The temple's location remained protected, accessible only to qualified scholars under Nora's guardianship. Her father's research had been posthumously published with proper attribution, revolutionizing understanding of pre-Columbian astronomy and earning him the recognition that had been stolen by his death. Dominic joined her, pressing a glass of wine into her hand and settling beside her with the easy familiarity of someone who'd become integral to her daily existence. His Marine Biology Research Institute now occupied the adjacent building, and their collaboration on environmental conservation had become the subject of several academic papers. I spoke with the adoption agency, he said softly, taking her free hand. We could submit our application next month, if you're ready. Jasmine turned to him, surprised, yet somehow not surprised. Somewhere between the temple's revelations and the subsequent months of rebuilding, they'd stopped asking whether they were moving too fast. The pace of their relationship was determined not by societal expectations, but by the undeniable certainty that they'd been moving toward each other long before they'd collided in a marketplace. I'm ready, she said, leaning into his shoulder. Though I want our child to know about my father, about his sacrifice and his brilliance. I want them to understand that adventure means something different to everyone, and sometimes the greatest discoveries are internal rather than external. Dominic kissed the top of her head. Our child will have an incredible mother to teach them about that. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching day surrender to night. The ocean murmured its ancient secrets, and somewhere in a protected temple deep in the jungle, Nora tended to artifacts that held the memories of civilizations long forgotten by the world. Jasmine's father's journal occupied a place of honor in the Institute's private collection, and sometimes Jasmine would find Dominic reading it, understanding her through the words her father had left behind. The adventure hadn't ended in the temple. It had simply transformed, evolving from the search for external mysteries into the discovery of something far more valuable: the willingness to be vulnerable with another person, to trust not blindly, but with eyes wide open to both possibility and risk. Elena was serving her sentence for complicity in Faisal's crimes, and surprisingly, she'd begun writing letters of genuine remorse to Jasmine. Redemption was possible, though it demanded accountability and the courage to honestly face one's failures. Jasmine had decided to engage with those letters, to understand how someone could become so twisted by ambition. Faisal remained imprisoned, his legacy reduced to a footnote in the story of discovery he'd attempted to monopolize. His attempt to control history had ultimately ensured his obscurity, which seemed to Jasmine like a kind of justice the universe had orchestrated with its own inexplicable logic. As the last light drained from the sky, Dominic guided Jasmine inside, where a table was set with candles and the food they both loved. And later, in the quiet darkness of their shared bedroom overlooking the ocean, they made love with the tenderness that comes from truly knowing another person. Not just their body, but their history, their vulnerabilities, their capacity for both extraordinary courage and profound gentleness. The map that had started everything hung framed in their living room, marking the coordinates of more than just a temple. It marked the beginning of everything that mattered: connection, trust, and the discovery that the greatest adventure was learning to build a life with someone who sees you completely and loves you anyway. Jasmine's father's sacrifice had led her not just to historical truth, but to a future she was building day by day with the man who'd caught her when she fell, and who'd continued catching her as they navigated the beautiful complexity of becoming each other's home. The sun rose over the ocean, the next morning as it always did, indifferent to human stories, yet somehow complicit in their unfolding. And in that small slice of paradise, where research and romance intertwined, Jasmine and Dominic began another day of their own making, writing their story one shared moment at a time.